The success of the auto pact prompted more appetite for open trade. The Canada-U.S. Free Trade Agreement signed in 1988 broadened the economic gains considerably. Manufacturing productivity in Canada increased about 14%. In 1994, with NAFTA, the trade relationship expanded further to include Mexico. And in 2020, this agreement was updated and renewed during the first Trump presidency. The durability of this trade agreement speaks to the benefits to all three countries. For roughly the past 60 years, our bilateral trade relationship with the United States has increased. Today, about 3/4 of Canada's goods exports flow to the United States. Canada is also the #1 export destination for the United States and the largest export destination partner for 32 of 50 states. Canada's biggest export to the United States is energy. Canadian oil, natural gas, gasoline, and electricity literally fuel the U.S. economy at a price no one else in the world can provide. And if we exclude our energy exports, the United States actually has a trade surplus with Canada.
Hey everybody, welcome back to the channel. Thank you all for the likes and the views and the subscribes. If you're not subscribed, please hit that subscribe button. We think our channel is being messed up right now. We're trying to get that VPN. So if you can help us get our goal to 1,000 subscribers, that would be great. And we'll show them that we are here to stay. And today we're going to be listening to the Bank of Canada. It's going to crash. We're going to crash within months as soon as these tariffs start. So whatever you guys can get your hands on, food, whatever, start stocking up. This is going to come all at once, and it's going to hurt us even more. So make sure you're subscribed, everybody. Like and subscribe.
Open trade between Canada and the United States has benefited both countries, increasing efficiency, spurring investment, boosting productivity, and raising standards of living. A significant increase in tariffs will kick all this into reverse. The economic consequences of a protracted trade conflict would be severe, but it would be a very different shock than the COVID-19 shock. In the pandemic, we had a steep recession followed by a rapid recovery as the economy reopened.
Sorry, I just got
This time, if tariffs are long-lasting and broad-based, there won't be a bounce back. We may eventually regain our current rate of growth, but the level of output will be permanently lower. It's more than a shock. It's a structural change. Now, to get an estimate of how much lower production and incomes would be, you need an economic model. And as described in our January Monetary Policy Report, we have combined a multi-sector, multi-country trade model with our main macroeconomic models of the Canadian economy to examine the impacts of a protracted trade conflict. Now, I do want to emphasize that models are imperfect at the best of times. So we need to be cautious, and we need, in this case, to be more cautious than usual because the lack of historical experience with big increases in tariffs. So please do not interpret these results as a forecast, but more as an illustration of the economic impacts. So with that caveat, Chart 2 shows an estimate of the long-run effects of higher tariffs. The gray line shows the bank's projection from our January MPR, which is our base case projection without tariffs. Economic output is steadily climbing. The blue line shows the impact of the anticipated tariffs based on the executive order signed by President Trump on February 1st, plus retaliatory tariffs by Canada. That executive order calls for 25% tariffs on non-energy exports and 10% on energy exports to the United States. Based on this scenario, economic output initially falls, then it steadies, and begins to grow again, but on a path that is 2.5% lower. Now, models can also help us understand the impact of tariffs in the short run. These are, the effects I'm going to show you are expressed relative to that January projection, which I just showed you the baseline. Now, the first thing we would see is a marked decline in exports. As Canadian goods become more expensive, U.S. demand for those goods would decline. A lower Canadian dollar would provide a partial offset. In our model, with the scenario based on the February 1 executive order, exports fall by about 8.5% in the year after tariffs takes effect. That's the green line. Canadian exporters respond by cutting production and laying off workers. With exports to the United States accounting for roughly 1/4 of our national income, the shock will be felt across Canada. Lower export revenues would reduce household income, and retaliatory tariffs would raise the prices of many consumer goods. As a result, consumer spending on everything from cars to entertainment to housing would slow. In this scenario, consumption, the purple line, declines by more than 2% by mid-2027. With export and consumer demand weakening, Canadian businesses would also cut their investment spending, and higher costs and lower profit margins would restrain investment further. With retaliatory tariffs on some goods and a lower Canadian dollar, businesses will face higher import costs. Canadian businesses, and I'm looking at them, buy roughly half of their machinery and equipment from the United States. In addition, profit margins are squeezed because higher costs are gradually passed on to final goods prices in Canada. So you got lower sales, higher costs, and reduced profit. Not surprisingly, they all combine to pull down business investment substantially. All told, business investment shown by the orange line declines by almost 12% by early 2026, 1 year after tariffs are imposed. So what would this all mean for economic growth? Well, in our January projection with no tariffs, we forecast growth of about 1.8% in both 2025 and 2026. But in the tariff scenario, the level of Canadian output falls almost 3% over 2 years.
Hey everybody, sorry that you see me moving the camera back and forth. It's because one of my stands on my camera is broken, so I have my old one and it's like tilted, so I'm waiting. I did order another one, supposed to be here sometime today from Amazon. I think it was Amazon or somewhere. Hopefully I'll get it in here soon. This is driving me nuts. So make sure you like, subscribe, everybody. We're trying to get 1,000 subscribers, and we also need a goddamn election, and we need one now. We're not going to make these tariffs, especially with the carbon tax on top of us. And if Mark Carney comes in March 9th, we're going to be even more screwed.
That's the blue line. That implies tariffs would all but wipe out growth in the economy for those 2 years. Finally, a trade conflict would push up prices even as demand weakens. Retaliatory tariffs on U.S. exports to Canada feed into the consumer price index. Roughly 13% of Canada's CPI basket is made up of goods imported from the United States. The depreciation of the Canadian dollar also increases the cost of all imported goods and services. Finally, integrated supply chains means tariffs can add costs at multiple stages of production. In our tariff scenario, the factors pushing up prices more than offset the downward pressure from weaker demand, so inflation rises. In January, the bank projected that inflation would remain close to the 2% target for the next 2 years. Tariffs would temporarily push inflation above 2%. If the economy is on a lower path and there's upward pressure on inflation, what's the response of monetary policy in the Bank of Canada? I know, that's what everybody really wants to know. What can I say? What the bank can do is we can help the economy adjust. With inflation now back around the 2% target, we are better positioned to contribute to economic stability. However, with a single instrument, our policy interest rate, we can't lean against weaker output and higher inflation at the same time. As we consider our monetary policy response, we will need to carefully assess the downward pressure on inflation from weakness in the economy against the upward pressure on inflation from higher import prices and supply chain disruptions. Unlike the pandemic, if tariffs persist, there will be no economic bounce back. Long-lasting tariffs mean lower potential output because our economy works less efficiently. Monetary policy cannot restore that lost supply. At most, it can smooth the decline in demand. The sharp fall in exports and investment when tariffs are imposed, combined with weaker consumption, means initially demand would fall more than potential output, creating excess supply in the economy. Provided the inflationary impact of tariffs is not too big, monetary policy can help smooth the adjustment by supporting demand so it doesn't weaken too much more than supply. But how much support monetary policy can provide is constrained by the need to control inflation. The initial impact of tariffs is a one-time rise in the level of consumer prices. Monetary policy cannot change that. What monetary policy can and must do is ensure that higher prices do not become ongoing inflation. This means making sure that households and businesses continue to expect inflation to remain well anchored on the 2% target. Simply put, monetary policy needs to ensure that the increase in inflation is temporary. Now, I hope, we all hope, Canada can continue open trade with the United States. A trusted open trade relationship benefits both countries. But if we are faced with a prolonged trade conflict, the only way to offset this negative structural change is with a positive structural change. Now, structural policies are appropriately the responsibility of elected governments and parliaments, not the Bank of Canada. So I will tread lightly here. The bank has previously highlighted Canada's productivity challenge, and it's good to see more focus by federal and provincial governments on structural reforms to increase productivity and investment by strengthening our economic union. Removing rules that restrict interprovincial trade or harmonizing or mutually recognizing provincial regulations could provide some offset to the increased trade friction with the United States. Provinces could also make it easier for workers to move within Canada by mutually recognizing different labor accreditations. There is also scope for all levels of government to reduce the timelines and uncertainty related to regulatory approvals. And better east-west transportation links would make trade within Canada less expensive and help get Canadian products to overseas markets. Again, it's not for the Bank of Canada to prescribe these policies or investments. But higher productivity means higher potential output and more capacity for growth without inflation. As Canada confronts the reality of increased trade friction with the United States, a concerted focus on productivity has rarely been more important. In some ways, the U.S. tariff threat is part of a broader global economic shift. The structural tailwinds of peace, globalization, and demographics that helped keep inflation low are turning to headwinds, and the world looks increasingly shock-prone. Higher long-term interest rates, elevated sovereign debt, and slower economic growth have made the global economy more vulnerable. Compounding these are war, rising trade protectionism, and economic fragmentation. Canada also has a structural supply challenge in its housing market. For years, the supply of housing has not kept up with demand, and housing affordability has deteriorated. These shifts all have implications for inflation. They may put more upward pressure on prices, and a more shock-prone world means more volatility in inflation. And that brings me back to my original speech topic, the bank's flexible inflation targeting framework. Since 1995, the 2% target has been jointly agreed with the Government of Canada. This gives it political legitimacy, and it gives the Bank of Canada the operational independence to conduct monetary policy. For the 25 years leading up to the pandemic, inflation was low and stable. But the pandemic tested the framework like never before. We faced huge shocks to both demand and supply, a deep recession, and a rapid rebound. As the economy reopened, inflation rose sharply, hitting 8%. Guided by the framework, the bank raised our policy interest rate forcefully to bring inflation back down. And since last summer, inflation has been close to 2%, and we've cut our policy rate to keep it there. In short, the framework was tested, and it proved resilient. The measure of the framework's success is not only whether inflation is close to 2%, it's also how the framework performs in the face of shocks, especially big ones. The next renewal of the framework is set for 2026, and the review begins now. Our focus in this review will be how we can improve the framework and its implementation to best address structural changes.
And if we don't get an election, we won't even have anything left. Trudeau is just going to go, go, go. Actually, Mark Carney's coming in on March 9th. So hold on onto your freaking hats, because it's going to be going nuts if Carney gets in. If Carney gets in, we're fucked. Like and subscribe, everybody. God bless. Stay safe, stay warm. And we'll see you in the next one, my friends.